The world I live in isn't what I thought it was. Prices should be falling, but we don't benefit from that because we're expanding the monetary supply at a quicker rate than those prices are falling. If you devalue the currency and you own debt, all of a sudden that debt becomes easier to pay. Or who is the biggest debtor in any nation?
Welcome to the Bitcoin RX podcast. This is your host, Nurse Ralph. Today, I got with me Seb Bunney, the author of the book, The Hidden Cost of Money. We're going to give you a weekly dose of orange pill so you don't die from fiat disease. Seb, man, what's up, man? How you doing?
Ralph, it's a pleasure. And I appreciate you reaching out. And as we're discussing before we jumped on, the Bitcoin community just never ceases to amaze me. It's when you put yourself out there and you allow life to unfold, you find yourself in such amazing opportunities. And so I'm looking forward to our conversation.
True. Same here, Sam. And honestly, it's a pleasure to have you because I've read your book and I really like your book. And I'm not just saying that because you're on my podcast. It's actually a well-written book. And I appreciate you giving me the time to talk about this. So I appreciate it, man. So before we jump into talking about Bitcoin, man, tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey before Bitcoin, if you don't mind.
So I would say, you know what, I was born in the UK and I was raised in New Zealand. My dad's British, my mum's a Kiwi, and my parents separated pretty early on. And I realized, you know what, reflecting back on my childhood, just how much, because my parents separated and I was raised by a single mum, just how much my mum having to go out and work and put food on the table for my two brothers and I, and we lived in this tiny little 2-bedroom house for many, many years, just how much our financial environment plays such a huge role in her ability to show up and try and support us. And so when we live in an environment where money is breaking down, where our cost of living is rising, where house prices are skyrocketing, parents can't show up to the extent they might want to be able to show up. And so when I look back on this, I'm like, oh my God, from the moment we're effectively born, and we may get into it, but even before we're born, money's already shaping who we are. And so, I ended up kind of getting down the rabbit hole of Bitcoin, purely just because I was passionate about mountain biking, but realized very early on that earning freaking $15 an hour, I'm never going to be able to raise a family. I'm never going to be able to buy a house, so it led me down the investing rabbit hole. And then as I was going down the investing rabbit hole, I started realizing, I was like, I thought we lived in a free market, but each time I'm taking these positions, they're not turning out or panning out how I expect. And that made me recognize just how we have a centrally planned economy. We have a central bank that governs interest rates, injects money into the economy. And so it makes it very hard for investors, especially those living under a free market mindset, to be able to view how the world is actually functioning. And that ultimately led me to Bitcoin. And I feel really lucky to have been on the journey that I've been on. And I would never have expected from a mountain bike instructor who spent my time in the mountains to be talking about money and to be talking about these things that, they seem so kind of different from my background.
Oh yeah. It's funny that you mentioned mountain biking and even $15 an hour or whatever. Even I feel like for I'm a nurse, and even nurses and doctors like me, even with the money that we're making, it almost feels like if you don't have the proper financial education, you can still struggle, even if you're making $40-$50 an hour. I feel like the amount of money that you make doesn't really mean that if you don't have a good place to store it, it doesn't matter how much you make, really. You will suffer eventually. So it's interesting that you went from that mountain biking to Bitcoin.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I think that what's really interesting is along those same lines, I don't necessarily think it's about how much money you earn. It's about how smart you are with your savings. And I think that you'll see people like doctors or architects or lawyers that are making 150, 200,000, but then they post their expenditure and they're renting a house for $20,000 a month. And it's just so you're still living paycheck to paycheck. Your paycheck is tens of thousands of dollars. And so I think that it's more about having financial smarts and being conscious about where your money goes. And I think that unfortunately, the world we live in, because money is breaking down, it's not incentivizing us to save, it's incentivizing us to consume. And so increasingly, we've got this society that looks to create happiness through external measures, through buying things, through living this lavish lifestyle. And I think social media plays into that. We've got all of these athletes and influencers that are showing their lavish lifestyle. And so people are just spending way beyond their means even when they're earning high income. And so it's just like what I love about Bitcoin is that, in a sense, it's like a religion, in that it's kind of sharing a base set of a moral framework. That moral framework is just like, you know what? How do I have more capacity to look inwards? How do I show up more authentically? How do I live life with integrity and honesty? And I think that these are like these moral boundaries that like Bitcoin is kind of sharing with the world. And I find that profound. So people are recognizing that happiness is not this external thing that comes about through purchasing stuff. Happiness comes about from deepening the relationship with the self and understanding who am I and how do I want to show up. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, I agree. I agree. Yeah, no, it's crazy because like ever since like I not just discovered Bitcoin, but ever since I started understanding Bitcoin more, like I spend less money on like useless stuff. Now I'm like everything that I buy, I'm like, do I really need this, or is this just like I always overthink it. I'm like, is this gonna help me in some ways? Neither it's health or neither it's gonna help me with my podcast or YouTube or whatever. Like I always like double think everything. So I find that interesting. I see a lot of other Bitcoiners, they do the same thing. I feel like that's like it's like a side effect of being a Bitcoiner. So I love that.
Well, and I wonder if the trait is one, it's like a curiosity, and two, it's a questioning. Like to get into Bitcoin, you have to break down so many of your long held beliefs as to how you think the world works, because you realize actually, do central banks and do the government have my best interests at heart? And then when you start pulling on that and you realize, I don't necessarily think they do, then you start digging into all of these other avenues, whether it's health, whether it is educational system, whether it's like the food and nutrition that we're eating, all of these things, you realize, the world I live in isn't what I thought it was. You know what I mean? And I think with that questioning mentality, it also comes down to how we live day to day. Like to your point, it's like, oh man, I really want this new thing. Do I actually need that? Where is this impulse coming from? Is it a legitimate impulse or is it something else? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I agree. Back to Bitcoin. When did that first click for you, actually?
You know what? I'll answer it in two ways, that question. The first way I'll answer it is that I think there are these pre-orange pill moments that set you up for understanding Bitcoin. And sometimes these pre-orange pill moments come about before it even existed. And so like the first one was when I look back at my childhood, just realizing how much when money breaks down, parents can't support their kids to the extent they might want to be able to. I was like, we need a better monetary system. And so that's kind of like the first one that started having me reflect back on how money impacts us. Secondly, again, like I mentioned about this approach to mountain biking, like I started coaching mountain biking. I realized I was not earning enough money. And not only that, but a lot of the idols which I looked up to when I was a teenager and I was looking at the big mountain bike movies, I would see the Tiger Woods of the mountain bike world. I would start working with these idols and I realized most of them were broke. Most of them didn't own property. Most of them were up to their neck in credit card debt, yet they were like on the big screen. They're in all of the big movies. And I was so confused. And so again, it had me recognize that when money breaks down, we can't actually pursue the things we want to be able to pursue to the extent we might like to be able to pursue them. And so it doesn't allow us to show up as authentically. And then finally, I think when I went down that investing rabbit hole, just realizing how much a broken monetary system isn't conducive to value being created in society. Now, when you look at a free market from a very high level overview, basically a free market allows for competition. What does that mean? It means that if I create a company and I offer a product, the only way for me to be able to thrive is to create a product which offers value. Because if I create a product which offers value, then money is going to flow towards me. So naturally, you have this river effect, this kind of downstream effect where money flows to where value is being created in society. But what's interesting is when you intervene monetarily, when you allow companies to be able to borrow artificially cheap capital, when you have the government stepping in, bailing out companies and industries, all of a sudden, you completely distort value creation in society. You can have whole industry sectors which are not offering value. You can have companies which are too big to fail, which are basically completely decimating productivity or capital, but they're still thriving because they're being pumped full of stimulus. They're obtaining free capital or artificially cheap capital. And so when I started looking at the world through this lens of a more free market approach, I was like, we have so much wastage in society. We have whole industries or sectors that arguably shouldn't exist. We have companies that are borrowing far beyond their means and still exist. And so like in the States, I think it's there's a index called the Russell 2000. There's 2,000 mid-sized companies that basically make up a representation of the mid-sized company market in the US. Now, what's interesting is today, 40% of those 2,000 companies are what are deemed zombie companies, which means they don't make enough to cover their interest expense, let alone be able to think about growth and expansion. And so you're just like, oh my God, like, how is it that 40% of these companies shouldn't exist, but they're still existing? And so when I started looking at this and all of the downstream effects, that's when I was like, we need a better monetary system. Like, how can we stop this from happening? And how do we create a system that enables value to flow, money to flow to where value is being created? And that ultimately, those kind of 3 points, my like childhood experiences, mountain biking, looking at the market through this free market lens, I think set the framework for when I stumbled upon Bitcoin being like, this is the answer to it. Like and so to answer your second question, which is what kind of led me down the rabbit hole of Bitcoin, I would say first off, like my brother used to buy drugs on the Silk Road. And I remember at the time, I was more interested in value investing and Warren Buffett. And I was like, this Bitcoin, it's worthless. Like, it doesn't have cash flows. I wouldn't even touch it with a barge pole. And now I look back and it's these little touch points. And so my brother started buying it on the Silk Road. Then I watched a couple documentaries. I think there was one, I'm trying to remember, it had like Charlie Shrem and it was on Netflix. And I probably watched it in about 2016, 2017. And I was like, this is really interesting. And I had a curiosity about it for quite a few years. But it wasn't really until I quit my job and focused all of my time in 2020 to Bitcoin that it really clicked as to just how influential money really is.
Right. It's funny that you mentioned the pre-orange pill thing, because I'm thinking back at it, like how I spent the first like 16 years of my life in Haiti, and I remember, like, I used to have uncles that used to travel to America and come back and give us like American dollar, and now I'm thinking about it, like how they used to give us an American dollars, and we would want the American dollar more than the Haitian dollar, and I never really like thought about like why is it that this money had more value than my own country's money, and like now I'm like, oh, this all makes sense. It explains why this dollar, this currency, has more value, more, I guess, more purchasing power in a way than
Mm-hmm.
the other country. But like, I think that's another thing that I need to think about more, like the pre-orange pill era that kind of led me to this, because like I think that part is important too. I mean, not everybody's got like, I mean, I think everybody's got one of those stories maybe, but like
Well, and
thinking about like back in the past, yeah.
I'm curious. The first thing, which I think is interesting, is there's a lot of evidence which shows actually the quickest growth rate in Bitcoin adoption is not in the Western world. Many times it's in these developing countries, these countries that have gone through hyperinflation or extreme poverty, because people, they understand what life is like when money breaks down. You know what I mean? And so sometimes you need that polarity between, oh my God, this is what life could be, and this is what life, under a Bitcoin standard, I see hope again. You know what I mean? Whereas I think living, especially in the States, the US dollar is arguably the strongest currency in the world. And it's got that reserve status. So it ensures that it preserves purchasing power because there's so much demand for the US dollar. But in a lot of these other countries, they don't have that benefit. But going back to your question, I'm curious, like, whether or not they're kind of pre-orange pill moments. When you look back at your childhood or your upbringing, where do you think your curiosity came from? Do you think it came from your parents? Like, do you think you've always been curious?
I think I've always, like, ever since like I was a kid, we used to have those little boxes, like well, I guess piggy banks, like a little box with some design on it with a little hole in between. And I used to, every time I get, like, if I get $20 to eat of food for school, I used to just like eat 10, save 10. So I was always a saver as a kid. So that's been my natural thing. And I think that started back then, and then now, like even before Bitcoin, I always like saving Bitcoin. I mean, my dad also loves saving money, and saving has been in my DNA, I guess. And I think I realized that at some point, like after I graduated nursing, or even during my nursing school, I realized that saving money alone is not gonna be enough. Like, I was just doing the math in the future. I was like, I will not be able to retire. Like, I would need to work like double overtime just to be able to save enough money. And then once I realized that saving money was not an option, that's when I went into the investing world, investing in the S&P 500, trying to like grow as much capital as possible because, I was thinking, inflation is 2% per year on average, and I need to beat that 2% or whatever. And then I was trying to make, 10% more per year. And if I did that for, I don't know, 30 whatever years, maybe I'll be able to live a comfortable life and then of course, when you go into the Bitcoin world, you discover that, well, inflation is not CPI and the empty money supply is going way faster than that. And you jump into these rabbit hole that you're like, oh God, I've been doing it wrong the whole time. So yeah, it's that I don't know. What was the question? That
Oh
was
no,
like
it's more about like, where do you think your curiosity came from? Do you think it came from your parents? Do you
I
think
think from my parents for sure.
Yeah.
Like from the beginning was like like I think saving money has been like we're known for saving money. That all started with my parents, and I think Bitcoin in a way brought back savings. You know what I'm saying? Because I feel like saving money is it's dead. I don't know if that's the proper. I don't know if
No, I wholeheartedly agree. I think that like there's a big difference, and this is one thing that I think Bitcoiners should talk more about, is that there's a big difference between investing and saving. Investing is meant to be the analysis of the market to be able to put your capital where you think it's going to be most productive, but as a result, you are taking risk. Whereas when you invest in something like Bitcoin, I can be confident that if I have one Bitcoin out of 21 million today, I can have that same one Bitcoin of 21 million in 20 years' time. And so, although, yes, there may be price fluctuation, there's no risk in terms of I can be confident that Bitcoin is going to continue to do what it's going to do from a protocol functional level. And I think that we should be able to save in society. And where I live in the Sea to Sky, which is just north of Vancouver in Canada. And it's mind blowing. Like I just recently moved from Whistler to a small town called Squamish, and the average income is something like 37,000 Canadian dollars a year, but the average house is $1.5 to $2 million. And you're just like, it's because we live in a very desirable place that there's a lot of demand for property. But I would also argue it's because when money no longer acts as a savings vehicle, people flood into real estate to use it to store value. So no longer are we using that property for its utility purpose to put a roof over people's heads. We're using it to store value. And it's wild because we've got a housing crisis, yet in the ski resort of Whistler, just north of me, 61% of the houses are empty. But we have a housing crisis, and it's because people are only using it to store value. Now, what's interesting is that, like, to your point, it's not just about saving. It's like, what am I saving in? Because if you're earning $37,000 a year, even if you're the freaking best saver in the world and you're able to save 50% of your income, well, cool, you're still only saving freaking $19,000 a year. But houses, if they're going up at 5 to 10%, and the house is $1.5 million, cool, you're saving $15,000 a year, and a house is going up at $150,000 a year. It's just the math just doesn't work. You can't keep up.
Yeah, it's impossible. Talking about inflation and housing and all that. Let's jump into your book for a second. How what do you think, like the 2% inflation? What role do you think that plays in like the hidden cost of money part in your book?
I would say that first off, like breaking it kind of down into two parts. First, I think that money is far more important than we give credit to. I think that a lot of us we don't really think about money. We go and use it day to day. We go and purchase groceries. We go and put gas in the car. We go and purchase maybe a new car. And if we're lucky, we purchase a house. And we just think of it as a medium of exchange. But money, in my mind, is far more than a medium of exchange. I think that when money breaks down, it leads to all of the issues that we face in society. So when money loses purchasing power, as we expressed a second ago, if money's losing purchasing power, it's going to disincentivize us to save, and it's going to incentivize us to consume, given that our purchasing power is greatest in the current moment. That also means that we lean towards a society that starts focusing on consumption over saving. That destroys our natural environment, because when we're consuming, well, that consumes resources. Resources come from the ground, they come from our waterways, they come from the forests. And so it's just like we decimate our natural environment when we have a very consumption-based economy. And two, you start to see it when money starts breaking down, parents have to go and work more. If parents are working more, they're spending less time with their kids. If they're spending less time with their kids, their emotional needs may not be getting met. And you wonder why we're having rising rates of depression, anxiety, drug use, suicide. And in more poverty-stricken areas, those rates have gone up exponentially. And so it's like money is shaping parents' ability to show up for their children. And then you also see it on the business front. When money is breaking down, businesses, instead of focusing on actually creating value, instead focus on how do I need to just basically make as much money as possible. And so value goes out of the drain. Or they think about financial engineering, where it's like, I need to access capital, I need to do share buybacks. And so they're focused more on financial engineering than actually creating products of quality that give back to the community. And so I think that when I say, there's a quote that I use in the book, which is everything is downstream of money. What I'm highlighting is that when money breaks down, when it no longer preserves purchasing power, when we don't have, it's not a permissionless system where if I am trying to spend my money in an area of the economy which the government doesn't want me to, they can stop me from doing that, then all of a sudden we start to face all of these repercussions in society. And so that's why I think it's so important for society today to trend towards a system that actually supports the currency holder. And it's in the best interest of the currency holder as opposed to the best interest of the central bank and the bank. So the second part of that question is this kind of idea of 2% inflation. Now, Jeff Booth has a phenomenal book, which I'm sure most people who are listening to this podcast have read, which is called The Price of Tomorrow. And what he talks about is that our environment is naturally what's called deflationary. So prices should be falling. Well, why is that? If we think back to evolutionary times when we were hunter-gatherers, we've always been striving to get more for less. Like whether it is create new little tools to be more efficient, to create a fishing rod as opposed to trying to fish by hand, to be able to build a vehicle to cover more ground quicker. And what's interesting is that, like, if we take almost any company, a company that is offering value because it's able to do something more efficient or cheaper or more productive. And so like Blockbuster versus Netflix, like we used to obviously have to drive down to Blockbuster, spend like whatever, 15 minutes driving, 30 minutes in Blockbuster choosing the video we wanted to watch. We'd leave Blockbuster, we'd drive home, we'd go to watch it, we'd realize it's scratched, and we're like, God damn it, then we've got to go return it. And so there's so much time and energy renting one movie. And now for the same price, we have got Netflix at our fingertips. And so prices should be falling, but we don't benefit from that because we're expanding the monetary supply at a quicker rate than those prices are falling. Now, why is the government doing this? Well, the government is doing this because if you have debt, if you as an individual owe money to someone, well, if purchasing power is falling and it's becoming harder to obtain capital, then it increases your rate or potential of defaulting on that debt. The flip side is also true. If you devalue the currency and you own debt, all of a sudden that debt becomes easier to pay. Well, who is the biggest debtor in any nation? It's the government. So the government has an interest to create inflation because it reduces their debt burden. And so inflation today, when they say they want a 2% target to stimulate the economy, what they're actually saying is we need inflation because we have too much debt and we can't service it effectively. And in order to be able to continue this debt-based economy, we need to be able to continually reduce the burden of our debt through devaluing the currency. The unfortunate problem is what that does is it transfers wealth from the savers to the debtors. Because if you're a saver and you've got $100,000 in your bank account and you're saving to buy a house, and all of a sudden houses go from 500,000 to $1 million, well, you've just lost 50% of your purchasing power. And so it transfers money from the savers to the debtors. And so that's the unfortunate problem or byproduct of our inflationary system.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I agree. I wanted to, before I forget, talk about the deflationary aspect that Jeff Booth talked about. That book was amazing. I feel like that book is the reason why I almost sold all my stocks and I just went all in into everything Bitcoin related, to be honest with you. But like, it's funny because like we have like, it's only a certain aspect, like it's only certain products that I've noticed that are like cheaper, like calculators, TVs. Like, how come, do you know, like, do you have any idea why only certain products are like getting cheaper over time and not like everything?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting because the products which get cheaper over time are the products that are not government-based education, or they're not heavily regulated by government. So when you allow competition, when you allow a free market to take place, prices tend to fall, as Jeff Booth says, to the marginal cost of production. So that means, well, most products or services have an input cost, whether that's the raw materials to make the product or it's the energy required to offer a service. So over time, when you have competition, margins start to squeeze because competition drives down prices. And so over time, things fall to the marginal cost of production. The example that Jeff Booth always gives is like a calculator app on the phone. Like he's like, when iPhones first came out, if you went to the App Store, you used to have to pay for a calculator app on the phone, whereas now they're free because there's so much competition in the space that if you try and monetize it, no one's going to buy your product. And so in a free market, prices fall. But the moment you put regulation in place, you create effectively these artificial monopolies. You create these moats that protect and preserve price. And so that's where in a free market, I actually very much believe that lobbying does not exist. Because if a company can earn money and then go to the government and then basically lobby them to alter regulation to their benefit, then you're basically putting artificial barriers in place to preserve their moat or their competitiveness, as opposed to allowing the free market to decide what people deem of value. And like on a slight tangent, you can see some of these changes taking place, not just on a price standpoint, but during, when was it? Maybe around the 1930s to the 1940s, the US government started subsidizing grain production. So they started subsidizing wheat and corn and a whole bunch of various different types of grain. And what that meant is that if you're a farmer and you're growing organic, regenerative style foods, well, all of a sudden you're incentivized because you'd make more money to move over to growing wheat and grain. Well, as a result, you started seeing people move away from these kind of like small little micro farms, these regenerative farms, and everyone just started growing grain. There was a whole bunch of excess grain. So we saw the proliferation of these grain companies. We saw companies like Kellogg's and Quakers explode. Well, Kellogg's and Quakers, because they had an artificial margin, basically an artificial capital, they were then able to use this capital to go and lobby the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. What did they do? They lobbied the FDA and they created the food pyramid. And they started basically saying, you know what, we're going to invert what people have been eating for millions of years. And we're going to say at the base of the food pyramid, what we need to eat is grain, and we should eat seed oils. And then at the top, we should only be consuming a tiny bit of natural products, as in meat and dairy and like saturated fats. And so all of a sudden, we have a society that believes what is actually healthy and what is needed is to eat all of these carbs, especially all these carbs that are sprayed with glyphosate and pesticides. And since then, what have we seen in the US? We've seen the absolute proliferation of obesity, diabetes, all of these health things, which I'm sure you probably see in your industry. You just see it everywhere. And so money artificially subsidized a whole industry that basically altered what we deem as healthy, which has led to all of these health issues. And that's kind of like this idea of like everything is downstream of money.
You mentioned the part about mental health as well. About that, how does the current monetary system affects our mental health? Because you talked about this in your book, talking about psychology, and I've noticed that and I work at a detox place, and a lot of the patients that I talk to, sometimes when they talk to me about their personal life, I've noticed that I mean, I don't want to say all of the problems, but like 50% plus of their personal problems. I'm thinking about it, like, man, like Bitcoin fixes this, Bitcoin fixes this. And I'm like, what do you think? How do you think the current monetary system, how do you think that affects people's mental health and their psychology?
Absolutely. No, and I think that's a really important question. And I think that, again, it goes back to the average individual. I don't think pieces together the connections between money and how they're showing up. And I think money very much shapes how we show up as individuals. And so I tend to, in the book, The Hidden Cost of Money, I talk about kind of like three main points. The first one is, as Bitcoiners are familiar with, is something called time preference. And so you can think of it as a spectrum. On one side of the spectrum, you've got high time preference thinking, which is I'm focused on my immediate needs right now. I'm not focused on anything in the future. I'm not focused on security. I'm just like, I want to meet my immediate needs. I'm going to be impulsive. I'm going to do this because that's what I need to do right now. And then you have on the other end of the spectrum, low time preference, which is kind of that I'm thinking about the future. I'm thinking about building security and prosperity, showing up authentically, even if that means in the short term doing something that maybe I don't want to do, but in the long term it's beneficial to me. That's kind of that more low time preference thinking. Well, what's interesting is when money is losing purchasing power, all of a sudden we are incentivized to spend in the present moment as opposed to save. So it shifts our thinking. It shifts our thinking towards that high time preference. Well, I'm going to be impulsive. I'm going to do this now. And I'm starting to see this more and more where, because even things like property are becoming increasingly out of reach, rather than saving, people are just like, well, I'm never going to be able to buy a house. So I'm just going to be able to live in the moment. I'm going to go partying. I'm just going to do this and go do that. And they have these very impulsive behaviors. And so money is shaping their impulsiveness. We're not thinking about long-term health. We're not thinking about building a family. We're seeing fertility rates drop off a cliff. People are not having kids. So it's fascinating. Money is shaping whether we show up in the moment or whether or not we're thinking long-term. And then the second one that I kind of tend to talk about is like meaninglessness. The challenge I think a lot of people face today is, okay, if I want to go, as we're talking about saving for a house, if I want to go think, I'm going to try and buy this 3-bedroom house, and this 3-bedroom house I think is going to take me about 10 years, 15 years to save for the down payment. So I'm going to be, if I'm 20, I'm going to be about mid-30s, I'm going to have my down payment, and then I'm going to get the house that I want. So then we start saving, we start saving, we start saving, and then 5 years in, oh, it's not going to take me 10 to 15 years, it's now going to take me 25 years. It's really easy for meaninglessness to set in because it's just like, what am I saving for? If I can't, I don't even know if I'm ever going to be able to buy this thing. And so the society we live in today, you wonder why people have high rates of depression. And it's because they just have no clarity about what their future holds. They don't know what their cost of living is going to be. They don't know where they're going to be living. They're just focused on basic survival needs because they're stuck and it's becoming harder and harder. So it's really easy for these like mental health crisis issues to kind of start arising. Depression, anxiety, drug use, those kind of things. And what's also really interesting is in psychology, there's this idea of our locus of control. And this means that if we have an internal locus of control, it is, I believe I have control over my trajectory, my path, my future. If you have an external locus of control, it's kind of like, I don't have any control over my trajectory, my path, my future. I'm just kind of at the whim of the environment around me. And what you see in society today is a whole bunch of people that are simply just existing. Like they don't feel like they have any control. And there's a lot of data which shows people with an external locus of control have much greater like health outcomes, like negative health outcomes. They have lower life expectancy, much higher rates of mental health issues, much higher rates of substance abuse. And so you start to realize again, when people can't plan, when people can't think about the future, when they're existing in the present, it leads to a whole bunch of these mental health issues. And then the final one that I'll talk about is just kind of like, we are community-driven individuals. We want to be in companionship. We want to be able to give back. We want to be able to create value. We want to be able to contribute. Since the dawn of time, we've been in these small little hunter-gatherer tribes, and we've wanted to be able to contribute to the community and give back. And the problem is that when money is breaking down, our aperture of awareness narrows. We become hyper-fixated on putting food on the table and putting a roof over our heads, as opposed to, how can I support my community? How can I give back to those around me? How can I kind of step outside of myself and do something bigger than myself? And so I think that in a world where all of a sudden we're stuck focusing on our immediate needs, food on the table, roof on our heads, our survival needs, we have less capacity to give back. We have less capacity to think altruistically. We have less capacity to be compassionate. And so a lot of these monetary challenges we're facing are leading to a lot of the mental health crisis issues which we're seeing in society, I would argue. Because what I'm noticing as well is when I come to a Bitcoin event, all of a sudden I'm seeing these people that they may not be millionaires or like completely financially sound, but what I'm noticing is they have hope. And when they have hope and they have more capacity to look inwards and think about, how do I want to show up? What is it that I value? You start to notice those mental health issues start to subside, and you have just an unbelievable community that wants to collaborate and give back, and they feel like they've got meaning in their life, and it's profound.
Right. Yeah, I've noticed that like Bitcoiners are a lot happier and less stressed than other people. And you know, the other thing too that you mentioned, like the part about the like the birth rate declining. I've noticed that like even along my friends, like I'm 32-year-old and I have a bunch of friends who are like in their late 20s and 30s, and it's like a lot of us don't have kids, and it doesn't feel like, I think nobody really questions why. It just feels like, oh, that's just the way it is now. You know, nobody questions why that is. Nobody, you know, it's like, oh, there's just the way society is going now. Do you think going back to a gold standard could fix that problem, or nah?
It's, you know what, I think that one, the gold standard has issues for the gold standard has its own issues in that, because obviously gold is physical, many times if you start saving more than a few $100, a few $1,000, you're going to have a sizable amount of gold, and now you got to figure out where you're going to store that gold. And a lot of people don't want to deal with the storage, so then they put that storage in some form of bank or centralized entity, and then that centralized entity recognized pretty early on, this is in kind of like 100 years ago, 150 years ago, that a lot of people were never coming back to claim their gold. So what they started doing was they started issuing receipts even though they didn't have the reserves to back those receipts. And so we created the first fractional reserve system where there may be $150 million in circulation, but there's only $75 million of gold backing that $150 million. And so I would say that gold failed because of its physical nature, and it doesn't allow people to custody things easy. But if we were to move towards a system that was able to preserve purchasing power, whether that is a new gold system that allows us to do that, or whether that's something like Bitcoin, I very much believe that a lot of the issues we're going to see are going to start to shift, including people having kids again. Because I think that like when people have capacity, people start to recognize how important companionship is and relationship is. And when I'm looking at the Bitcoin community, it's amazing. Like there are so many kids being born right now in the Bitcoin community, and you go to these Bitcoin events and everyone has got families or they're wanting families. And so we're seeing those desires shift away from this whole millennial generation, which has basically struggled financially. They don't have security. And all of a sudden, they're just living these nomad lifestyles, which on paper look amazing, on social media look amazing. But then you go and talk to a lot of these individuals and they're depressed. They're not that happy. They don't really feel like they've got purpose. They don't really feel like they've got community. And so I think that on the grand scheme of things, I think we're companion-based individuals that want to create family, we want to create community, we want to have kids. And our society is not conducive to that. So we're telling ourselves another story. But if we're able to preserve purchasing power, if we're able to save again, if we're able to have hope, I think we're going to start to see that come back into play. And I'm 32 as well, and no one around me wants to have kids.
It's so sad, man. I'm like, man, come on. Oh yeah, there's sunshine at the end of the tunnel. You just gotta look for it. Yeah, no, that's fair. I was gonna ask about your book as well. If you had one message from your book that you could spread to everybody, what would it be? I know it's a tough one because your book is full of knowledge and yeah. So I know that one's it's a tough one.
You know what? Like, there's a chapter that I didn't include in the book. And I started writing the chapter and I was like, oh man, I don't know if people are ready for this one. And the chapter was talking about Bitcoin and spirituality. And to me, I think one, I wanted to first get people down the rabbit hole that money is more than just a medium of exchange. Money shapes who we are and how we show up. And to the points we've just been talking about, it shapes our personality. It shapes our ability to show up for others in our community. And so with that in mind, the chapter that I really wanted to write, which I kind of talk about indirectly through the book, is that I think Bitcoin is a spiritual tool. I think that as we gain more capacity financially, we have more time. As we have more time, we have a greater ability to look inwards. With that greater ability to look inwards, we can deepen our relationship with ourselves to understand who we are, what it is that we value, how we want to show up, how we want to treat others. And I think we become way more grounded and way more connected. And I think that today, I think the issue we face in society is that everyone is just so disconnected. We're so tied into our digital devices. One, because digital devices are addictive, but two, because life is so hard, we're just looking for a distraction. And so it's just like, I believe Bitcoin is a spiritual tool because it regrounds us and gives us greater capacity to look inwards and reflect and recognize how we want to show up authentically. And yeah, I think we just have a world that is lacking in authenticity right now, and I think we can get back to that with Bitcoin.
Yeah, I agree. I like the spirituality aspect of Bitcoin because I was thinking about it too the other day. I was like, it's like I'm we were talking on other podcasts and all that. It's not like I'm making money off of this really. Like I'm not monetized or anything. I'm just doing it because I feel like this is something that I need to do just as like to educate more people and to give back to the community. I think spirituality has different meaning to everybody, but I think that's my way of giving back and helping others and maybe trying to, orange pill my friends and families and, sending them some, hey, listen to this conversation. Like you might learn a thing or two. I think that's important too. And also another thing I was looking at the other day too, how in the Bible, there are a lot of, I don't know if you are religious or anything like that, but but like there are a lot of like part of the Bibles that talks about money. There are a lot of verses in the Bible that talk about money and wealth, and people don't really think about that, and how, there's like little things about, like, how, they just talk about how interest is theft, and there's like so much about spirituality, but I don't know enough about it to like have a strong opinion. But I think that's something that people should look into, honestly. Like, I
Mhm.
like
You know,
that.
I was I was actually just recently in at like a kind of a Bitcoin conference based out of Jackson Hole, which is kind of a ski resort in Wyoming. And oh my god, that place energetically is a profound with the Tetons, the mountains there. It's so grand. But I had a phenomenal conversation with an individual, and we were talking about how one of the reasons why maybe Christianity or religions in general, not just Christianity, but religions in general, may be struggling, is that there's a lot of trust and a lot of faith that goes into and a lot of belief without being able to verify. Like you're passing down these stories, you're reading this Bible, but there's a lot of people that are questioning, like, well, is this true? How is this true? Where did this come from? And I can understand that point of view, especially people that maybe haven't had that knowingness or those personal experiences with a God of sorts. What is interesting is that, like, I see religion as a moral framework. It's how do people pass down these teachings through generation, through generation, through generation. And all of these stories are methods of passing down these amazing teachings that teach people how to show up, that teach people how to treat those around them, that teach people like these core morals that I think what creates like a cohesive community. Now, what is interesting is, in a sense, I see Bitcoin as a verifiable religion, in that you have something that you can actually verifiably prove, hey, there's 21 million coins, this is the rule set, and everyone is playing by the same rules. But the thing that's interesting is, because of the framework which Bitcoin is built upon, these more free market fundamentals, it too is like a moral framework. It's a religion of sorts. It's passing down these ways to show up with integrity. You want to be honest. If you as a miner are not honest, you're not going to receive your block subsidy, and therefore you're going to be disincentivized to act against the community. And so there's certain moral frameworks or values that pass down through Bitcoin, just like pass down through religion. But instead of at the base of religion having a trust us, or you've got to have your own belief in it, with Bitcoin, it's like, hey, no, I can audit the code if I want to, and I can see that there's 21 million. I can check my transactions actually took place. And so I think that Bitcoin is really unique because it's almost like a digital religion of sorts, and not in a cult-like way, but in just a way to pass down a moral framework.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, I agree. I agree. And yeah, no, that's true. And have you read there's a book about, it's I don't remember if it's the Bible and Bitcoin or the
There's
oh
Thank God for Bitcoin.
there's Thank God for Bitcoin as well. Yeah, there's a few of them that talk more about spirituality. And I feel like I want to like read them again and maybe like dive a little deeper into it, because there's a lot to it that relates to religion, not just Christianity, but like just
Totally.
religion in general. And I like that. Let's talk about fiat and wars for a second. I mean, not we all know, but like us Bitcoiners, at least we know that wars are just an excuse to print money, basically. Do you think that's going to eliminate wars, or do you think that's going to, oh, do you think we're just, humans are going to be humans? We're going to find a way to fight each other no matter what. What do you think about that in the future?
I think that, to be honest, I think the war will always necessarily take place because there's always going to be disagreements, and there's always going to be resources at which people want, or land that people want, or you name it, whatever the reason for certain wars are. What I think is interesting under a Bitcoin standard is that at the moment, when we go into war, when the US goes to war, Ukraine goes to war with Russia, you can have these endless wars at the expense of the populace. The populace may not even agree with the war, but because the government controls the monetary printer, they can continue to hit print, devaluing the currency to fund operations. Now, we saw this during the 1970s Vietnam War. Well, we ended up basically detaching from the gold peg to be able to fund operations in Vietnam and extend and prolong the war. Well, if we lived on a Bitcoin standard, what that means is that the only way for the government to fund operations is for them to be able to listen to the populace and for the populace to be able to support the government and voluntarily hand over their Bitcoin to pay taxes because they have a belief in what the government is doing. Well, if the government wants to go to war, first, it's got to save up to be able to go to war. It needs to be able to save up capital to be able to fund operations. And secondly, if the government does go to war and it doesn't have support from the populace, the populace can quickly stop capital flow to government, and that war is going to end. But it also means that if that nation does go to war and it's saved up and it starts going to war and starts realizing, this is a losing game, we're going to run out of our resources pretty quickly, that war is going to end far, far, far quicker. And so I think, although I don't necessarily think war is just going to stop altogether, I think that's a part of the human condition. I do believe that war would be a hell of a lot shorter. There would be a lot less death. There'd be a lot less negative side effects of war, and would be a lot more conscious about going into war. Because I think a lot of these wars are started by nations like Ukraine is at war with Russia right now. Ukraine doesn't have the resources to be able to continue to support that war, which is why it's reliant on Europe, it's reliant on the US, it's reliant on Canada to be able to fund that war for it. And it's just like, why are we fighting other people's wars? You know what I mean? It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I agree. And I was looking into your profile, and I noticed that you have something called Looking Glass Education. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What is
For sure. Yeah. So I feel at the start of the pandemic, being absolutely transparent, I'd never written anything in my life. Like I dropped out of school when I was 14 years old, dropped out of English when I was 12. And I felt compelled, given my background in teaching mountain biking and educating, and I've always loved to be able to support people in their learning journey, I felt compelled to start trying to articulate some of my views on the world and how inflation was leading to wealth inequality and how it was impacting the middle and lower class. And so I wrote this article called When More Isn't Better, Inflation in the 21st Century. And I think I released it in early 2021, I think. I wrote it through 2020 and then released it in early 2021. And at the time, I had like 11 followers on Twitter, didn't know anyone. And Greg Foss, who in the last cycle was just an incredible advocate for the Bitcoin space, he picked up the article and was just like, hey, is it okay if I share it with a few individuals? And then that managed to find its way into kind of Bitcoin Magazine and onto a few different sites. And so it really started there. But what Greg ended up doing is he connected me with another guy called Daz and a couple others. And we founded something called the Looking Glass Education. And the whole goal is like, how do we create content for the layperson? How do we create content for the average working individual to be able to better understand why they're facing the issues they're facing? And where does Bitcoin fit into all of this? How does Bitcoin work? What is it? And that was the whole goal with Looking Glass. And we wanted to make sure all of our content was free and accessible. And so like anyone who's listening to this, you can just pop to Looking Glass. I think it's just lookingglasseducation.com, and you'll find all of our resources for free. We've got a Bitcoin course that's now being taken by tens of thousands of people, and they absolutely, like, we've just been blown away by the response to it. And that ultimately, like, that led to writing The Hidden Cost of Money, because I recognized there was a common thread amongst all of my writing, which was I realized that there's these hidden costs to our current monetary system. And I was talking about family, I was talking about business, I was talking about politics, I was talking about the environment. And I was like, I think there's a book that needs to be written here, because I haven't heard of a book that talks about these things.
Yep, I like that. For on your website, do you guys offer like one-on-one, or is it just like a list of courses that people can take? How's the design?
So we, at the moment, it's just kind of like primarily courses, and there's a bunch of courses. There's also a bunch of like long form blog articles. It's got all of our kind of historical podcasts. We haven't been updating the content too much more recently. One of the things we wanted to stay away from is to have like a news-based site. We feel as if there's phenomenal magazines, there's amazing news-based stuff out there. We wanted to focus on like evergreen content, that if you came and read or worked through one of our courses in 5 years' time or 10 years ago, it still made sense. Because I think that in the end, it's understanding these frameworks for the world in which we live in, as opposed to, oh, this just happened in this industry in this bank. You know what I mean? Like we don't want to talk about news. But we have a platform which is part of Looking Glass called HODL. And HODL is like the overprotective approach to self-custody. So if people who are going down the rabbit hole of Bitcoin are nervous about like, man, how do I store my Bitcoin? I want to learn more about this. We do one-on-one sessions for people that are interested in learning more. And you can find that if you just go to our website, up in the navigation bar. I think it's called HODL or custody support. And we're more than happy to help out with that kind of stuff.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I'll put those links down in the description below so people can find those things. And from educating people about all of this, what has been one of the biggest misconception about not just Bitcoin, but also money? Have you noticed anything?
You know what? I think there's a saying that I love, which has been coming out more recently. There's a sticker you can find sometimes at the conferences, which is not mining Bitcoin wastes energy. And I think everyone is always saying like mining Bitcoin wastes energy. It's like, no, no, no. There is too much wasted energy globally. Like most people have never really dug too deep into how our grid functions. And the fact that our energy grid that our houses are attached to typically operates at like 40 to 60% capacity. Because in the event that there was a hot spell in the summer and everyone turns on their AC, or there's a cold spell in the winter and everyone turns on their central heating, well, that's going to massively ramp up energy demand. So at any moment, because it has to account for that, we're creating enough energy for 100% demand, but we're only using 40 to 60%. We don't have the battery technology to be able to store that excess energy in batteries. We have very limited battery technology. So instead, we're just basically just evaporating the remainder of that energy. It's wasted. It's just being burnt off. And so what I think is fascinating about Bitcoin is that we're able to take that stranded energy and we'll be able to monetize it. We've never been able to do this in history before. We're able to monetize it, which ends up lowering the cost of energy for everyone else. And so you look at grids like the Texas grid, where they're stabilizing the energy grid through mining Bitcoin, and ultimately it's beneficial to the end user, lowers cost of energy, stabilizes grids. It's profound. So not mining Bitcoin wastes energy.
Wow, wow, wow. I never thought about that. That is interesting. That hits different. Not mining. Okay, interesting. And also, there's this famous thing that's been going around, how if Bitcoin doesn't become a medium of exchange, it will fail. What do you think about that one? Do you agree with that or disagree?
It's a tough one. I don't think I have fully formed opinions on it, and I think that there are many things that act as a store of value that aren't a medium of exchange. Houses, for instance, have now become a store of value, but they're not necessarily immediate. They're not a medium exchange. We don't go and just go swap a house to go and buy some tomatoes. We don't, and so I think that Bitcoin can still survive as a store of value. I just don't think it's going to have that same adoption rate that we would have if we were to also see it used as a medium exchange. And on top of that, I also think that at the moment, given our current system, there's something called Gresham's law, which is bad money drives out good, which is that when you have legal tender laws, and merchants are able to, merchants have to accept the local currency. Well, people are going to spend their poor money and they're going to hoard their better money. And so they're going to spend the US dollar, they're going to spend the Canadian dollar, they're going to spend the British pound, and they're going to hoard Bitcoin. And so I think in the short term, I think Bitcoin, until we actually remove legal tender laws, it's going to be hard for Bitcoin to compete on an even playing field with a lot of these local currencies. That does not mean it's failed. I think that it's just highlighting that at the moment, people are prioritizing its store of value properties.
Yep. Other than that number go up technology, how else has Bitcoin changed you personally?
Oh man, like Bitcoin, like everything that we've discussed around kind of like the psychology of things. Bitcoin has lowered my time preference. I'm thinking about the future. I'm thinking about building prosperity. I'm thinking about things with so much more hope. And going into the pandemic, I was scared. Like I was just like, what does my future hold? Like I don't know how I'm going to get ahead. Like I have no idea. And I see some friends and some family members that they have not come down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, and it's hard to just see the demise of society and the nihilistic vision of the world when you don't have that hope. And so I think Bitcoin really has shaped me. It's given me so much more hope for the future. And it's just altered my capacity to be able to kind of give back and think more about my community and contribution and stuff.
Yeah. I have one last question for you that I ask everybody. If you could go back in time, other than buying more Bitcoin, what advice would you give yourself?
To buy more sats. No, I'm just
We all would, huh?
You know what? I think that in more recent years, I've started to recognize that my personal journey in this life is to get out of my head and into my body and listen more to my intuition and listen more to my gut and develop that skill, because I think that the world we live in, it's very cognitive. We give a lot of power to the thinking mind and the thinking brain. And I've went through years where I was consuming so much content for the sake of consuming content and trying to learn about the world, when I think that we can tap into the collective unconscious. And I think we have so much access to a deeper knowledge internally. And so I would have started my own personal spiritual journey a lot earlier than now. But I still feel at the same, I don't regret that in the slightest, because I think along the way, everything that I've kind of, the challenges I've dealt with have allowed me to be who I am today.
Right. Yeah, the past kind of did shape you right now. So no, I agree. Yeah. Thank you for your time, and I appreciate you coming on the podcast. Where can people find you if they need you?
They can, so Seb Bunney, and Bunney is Bunney. That's sebbunny.com if you want to go to the website and blog. Seb Bunney on Twitter. And yeah, one thing that I always want to make sure is that, like, price is never a barrier to education. So if anyone's ever listening to this and they're like, you know what, I'd love to read your book, but I don't have the money to buy your book, feel free to just reach out and on Twitter or through my website, and I'm more than happy to just send you a digital version of the book for free. And yeah, again, Ralph, I really appreciate having me on. And yes, just
thank you for your time, man. I appreciate it.